The wagon jolted violently as it turned off the main road onto a narrow, dust-choked trail. Evelyn clutched the edge of the wooden bench, her fingernails digging into the splinters. Every bone in her body rattled with each rut and stone beneath the wheels. Beside her, the driver kept his eyes fixed ahead, his face hidden beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat. He hadn't spoken a word since sunrise. Only the occasional grunt to the horse broke the silence. Evelyn's throat felt raw, her lips cracked from the dry wind. A thin scarf covered her hair, but strands clung to her forehead in sticky, nervous curls. Her dress, once pale blue, was now caked in road dust, the hem torn where she'd stumbled climbing into the wagon that morning. When they crested the final rise, she saw it. A lonely ranch house crouched in a sea of brittle, sun-bleached fields. The house looked worn, its wooden boards warped and gray. A long porch sagged under its own weight, and a single oil lantern flickered weakly near the doorway, despite the harsh midday light. Evelyn's stomach turned as the wagon creaked to a stop. The driver swung down, tossing her small bundle of belongings into the dirt with careless force. "Get down," he muttered without looking at her. She hesitated, her legs trembling as she rose. The moment her boots touched the dry ground, a wave of heat shimmered up from the dust, clawing at her face. She bent to pick up her bundle, her fingers trembling. A shape moved at the far end of the porch. Slowly, a tall man stepped into the doorway. His frame was thin but rigid, his shoulders sharp as fence posts under a dark coat. His face was long and pale, the jaw clenched beneath a salt-and-pepper beard. A wide hat cast his eyes into shadow, but Evelyn felt them on her like hooks. The driver tipped his hat in a hasty, uneasy gesture and climbed back onto the wagon. Without another word, he snapped the reins, and the horse lurched forward, pulling the wagon away in a cloud of choking dust. Evelyn stood alone, clutching her bundle against her chest as the echo of wheels faded into the horizon. The man remained still, studying her. Then, in a voice as dry and brittle as the land itself, he spoke. "Evelyn," he said. Her name fell from his mouth like a verdict. "You'll come inside." She swallowed hard, unable to find her voice. Her feet felt nailed to the ground. He took a single step forward. The old porch boards creaked under his weight. "Now." The words snapped through her like a whip. She stumbled forward, each step a battle against the scream building in her chest. The porch rose before her like a gallows, every shadow along the boards deep and hungry. At the top step, she hesitated again. The man moved aside just enough to let her pass, his coat brushing her shoulder as she slipped into the doorway. Inside, the air felt heavy and stale, like a room sealed for years. The hallway stretched narrow and dark, lined with faded wallpaper that peeled in curling sheets. A single oil lamp flickered on a crooked table, throwing long, sharp shadows along the floor. Behind her, she heard the door close, not slammed, but slow and final, like the turning of a heavy lock. Evelyn clutched her bundle tighter, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. She looked back once, hoping for a last glimpse of the empty land outside, but found only the man's silhouette filling the doorway. His voice drifted toward her again, low and deliberate. "You'll learn the rules tomorrow. Tonight you stay quiet. You belong here now." Evelyn's mouth trembled, but no words came. Her eyes stung as tears welled, blurring the thin line of light at the end of the hall. She stood there frozen, her bundle slipping slowly from her arms, landing with a dull thud at her feet. The man stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath each heavy footfall. His shape loomed larger in the flickering lamplight, swallowing the space between them inch by inch. And in that moment, Evelyn felt the last breath of her old life exhale from her chest, gone into the dry, endless wind outside. Evelyn woke to the sound of boots against the hallway floorboards. She sat up too quickly, the thin blanket twisting around her ankles. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The walls pressed close, the air smelled of dust and oil, her throat dry and rough. The door swung open. Mr. Holt filled the doorway, a dark shape against the faint glow of morning seeping through a distant window. "Up," he said. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her knees wobbling. She clutched her dress at the waist to stop her hands from shaking. He stood watching, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "This way," he ordered. She stepped into the hallway, careful not to brush against him. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, and a spider web drooped from a corner near the ceiling. The smell of something burned drifted faintly from deeper inside the house. Mr. Holt led her to a narrow kitchen. A small wooden table stood in the center, two cracked mugs resting on its scarred surface. A pot of thin porridge steamed weakly on the stove. An older woman stood at the counter, her back hunched, gray hair pulled into a tight knot. She didn't look up. She stirred the pot slowly, her bony fingers moving in a practiced, lifeless rhythm. Evelyn hovered near the doorway until Mr. Holt turned sharply. "Sit." She dropped onto the nearest chair, her eyes fixed on the table. Her stomach churned at the smell of the porridge, but hunger clawed at her ribs. The older woman ladled a scoop into a chipped bowl and placed it in front of her without a word or glance. Evelyn picked up the spoon, her fingers clumsy and slow. Mr. Holt leaned against the doorway, arms folded, eyes locked on her. "You eat when told, you speak only when spoken to, you work when I say. You do not go beyond the yard, you do not ask questions, you do not look inside the barn." His voice was flat, each word dropping like a hammer. Evelyn kept her eyes down, her spoon trembling over the bowl. "Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to form words. He waited. A long, thin silence stretched across the room, filled only by the faint scrape of the woman's ladle. "Say it," he demanded. Evelyn swallowed hard. I understand." Mr. Holt's eyes narrowed, as if studying a piece of flawed wood. Finally, he pushed himself away from the doorway and disappeared into the hallway. Evelyn forced the porridge into her mouth. Each bite felt like swallowing thick mud, but she didn't dare stop. Across the kitchen, the older woman continued her slow, endless stirring, her face turned away as though she, too, had long ago learned to keep her eyes down. When Evelyn finished, she set the spoon down carefully, her fingers aching from the tight grip. The woman took the bowl silently and turned back to the stove, her thin shoulders hunched deeper. Evelyn stayed seated, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the next order. Outside the small, grime-streaked window, she saw the yard, dry dirt, a few scattered weeds, and beyond that, the barn. Its doors were shut, but even from here, the dark slit between them looked like an open mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She looked away quickly, her breath catching in her chest. From the hallway, Mr. Holt's voice drifted back toward her, sharp and final. "You start outside today, the woodpile. You'll be watched." Evelyn pressed her palms against her skirt, her pulse pounding in her ears. She stood slowly, each movement heavy as if she carried stones in her bones. As she stepped toward the doorway, she cast one last glance at the older woman. For a fleeting second, the woman's eyes flickered up, hollow, gray, and shining with something Evelyn could not yet name. Then the woman looked away, the ladle moving in its endless circle, and Evelyn stepped into the yard, her shadow swallowed instantly by the harsh rising sun. The sun burned high and pitiless by the time Evelyn reached the woodpile. Her palms were already raw from dragging the heavy logs across the yard, splinters biting deep into her skin. Sweat clung to her dress, turning the pale blue fabric nearly black in places. The ranch yard stretched wide and empty around her. Only the thin whistle of wind and the distant creak of the porch boards broke the silence. The barn loomed at the edge of her vision, its doors sealed shut, but she felt its presence like a second set of eyes crawling over her back. Each time she glanced up, she saw Mr. Holt standing on the porch, his arms folded across his chest. Even at this distance, she could feel his gaze, sharp as a blade, following her every move. Near the barn, a thin man limped past carrying a bucket of water. He was older, his spine bent, a ragged hat casting a thin shadow over his sun-leathered face. He never looked up. His eyes stayed glued to the ground, as if the dirt itself might swallow him if he dared lift his head. Evelyn paused, the log slipping from her fingers. For a breath, she watched him shuffle toward a side shed. A small, desperate hope stirred in her chest. Maybe he could help. Maybe he would speak. But as if sensing her thoughts, the man quickened his limp, disappearing into the shadows without a word or glance. Farther back, she noticed the older woman from the kitchen step briefly into the sunlight, empty pail in hand. She paused at the well, her hands working the pump with slow, practiced strokes. Evelyn caught the woman's face in profile, the same hollow, distant stare as before. When the bucket was full, she turned without looking around and vanished inside. A dry wind picked up, tugging at Evelyn's hair and lifting dust in thin, ghostly spirals. She bent to pick up another log, her arms trembling with each motion. The splinters dug deeper, but she kept going, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. At one point, she let herself glance toward the barn again. The doors stayed closed, but something inside shifted. A faint scrape, so soft it could almost have been imagined. She straightened slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The thought pushed up from some deep place in her mind. "What is in there?" She looked back at the porch. Mr. Holt hadn't moved, his silhouette stiff and unwavering. Evelyn quickly dropped her gaze and bent over the log pile again, forcing her hands to work, despite the sting and throb in her fingers. The sky above her felt endless and sharp, a cruel dome pressing down. Every sound, every movement, the flap of a loose shutter, the creak of an unseen hinge, twisted into a quiet threat. She felt her strength drain as the sun slipped lower, turning the dust into sheets of harsh orange light. Her dress stuck to her back, and blood from her palms smeared onto the logs, leaving dark fingerprints she tried not to see. Near dusk, Mr. Holt finally stepped off the porch. She heard his boots before she saw him, each step slow and deliberate. Evelyn stiffened, her back rigid as he approached. He stopped a few paces away, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Enough for today," he said. She kept her eyes on the dirt. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. "Inside," he added, turning without waiting for her response. Evelyn hesitated, her gaze flicking once more to the barn. The doors stood unchanged, yet she felt them watching her all the same. She followed him back across the yard, each step heavy, her hands throbbing with every heartbeat. At the doorway she paused just a moment, turning her head, as if to see the last edge of the sun sinking behind the barn. Then she stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a low, hollow thud that echoed in her bones. That night, Evelyn lay curled on the narrow cot in the small side room. The thin blanket scratched at her bruised skin, and every small movement sent waves of pain through her raw palms. Outside her window, the moon hung heavy and low, its pale light catching on the dry dust that drifted past like slow-moving smoke. She tried to listen for any sounds beyond the walls, wind, footsteps, anything, but all she heard was the frantic rush of her own pulse. At some point she drifted into a shallow, broken sleep. She saw her father's face in a dream, lined with worry, his eyes hollow. His lips moved, but no words came out. Behind him, the shape of the ranch house grew taller and darker, swallowing the sky. Evelyn reached out, but he slipped away into the blackness. A noise snapped her awake. A distant, muffled thud, somewhere deep in the house or beyond. She sat up too fast, her head spinning. The room felt smaller in the moonlight, the corners full of shifting gray shadows. She crept toward the window, careful not to let the old floorboards creak under her feet. Outside, she saw the barn. The doors were closed, but a thin sliver of light escaped from a crack between them, wavering like a weak flame. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, trying to see more. Then, just for an instant, she thought she saw a figure moving inside. Slow, heavy, like someone dragging a load across the floor. Her skin prickled. She pulled back sharply, her spine hitting the wall. She glanced toward her door, expecting to hear boots in the hallway, but the house stayed silent. She sank to the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. Her mind churned. Who is in there? Why is there light? The memory of Mr. Holt's voice cut through her thoughts, cold and final. You do not look inside the barn. She buried her face in her arms, forcing herself to breathe slowly. But no matter how tightly she closed her eyes, the image stayed. That flicker of movement behind the barn doors, the light like a dying heartbeat. Hours seemed to slip by in silence. Every time she drifted close to sleep, her body jerked awake, as if some invisible hand yanked her back. When dawn finally brushed the horizon in pale streaks of pink and gray, Evelyn felt no relief. She rose slowly, her legs heavy and stiff. She washed her hands at the small basin, watching the water run pink from the raw scrapes on her palms. She wrapped them in the corner of her skirt, pressing until the sting faded into a dull throb. A sharp knock rattled her door. She jumped, her breath catching in her throat. Mr. Holt's voice followed, flat and cold, through the thin wood. Out, now! Evelyn swallowed hard and turned to the door. As she reached for the handle, her fingers trembled so violently she had to grasp it twice before she could turn it. The hallway yawned open before her, narrow, gray, with the same peeling wallpaper and that sour, heavy smell that seemed to follow her everywhere. She stepped out, and in the instant before she lowered her gaze, she thought she saw a smear of dark red near the base of the far wall, half hidden by a loose scrap of wallpaper. She looked away quickly, her heart stuttering in her chest. Mr. Holt stood waiting at the other end of the hall, his hat already on, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. "Kitchen first," he said. Evelyn nodded, her lips cracking as she forced them closed. She followed, her footsteps muffled on the worn floorboards, the cold echo of the barn light still pulsing somewhere deep in her mind. A silent promise that whatever she thought she understood about this place was only the beginning. The kitchen felt colder than before, though the morning sun had already begun to creep across the cracked floor tiles. The older woman stood by the stove, her back bent low, as she stirred a pot of thin porridge. The room smelled faintly of scorched grain and old grease. Evelyn took her place at the table without a word. Her hands lay heavy in her lap, the raw scrapes hidden beneath folds of her skirt. The woman ladled porridge into a chipped bowl and set it down in front of her, still without meeting her eyes. Evelyn forced herself to eat, each mouthful thick and tasteless. She felt Mr. Holt's gaze on her from the doorway, unblinking, measuring every small motion. When she finished, he stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply on the worn tiles. "Outside," he ordered. She rose slowly, her legs stiff. Outside, the morning light seemed too bright, turning the yard into a pale, endless sheet of dust. She squinted, swallowing the dryness that clung to her throat. Mr. Holt led her toward the barn. As they approached, Evelyn's heart picked up a frantic beat. The doors stood closed as always, but today they felt even more imposing, their wooden planks dark and scarred with deep scratches she hadn't noticed before. He stopped abruptly, turning to her. "You do not touch these doors," he said, his voice low and sharp as a blade. She nodded quickly, her eyes darting to the ground. "Stack wood today. No wandering, no looking?" His words felt like nails hammered into her skin. "Yes, sir," she whispered. He held her gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the porch, each step echoing in her head like a drumbeat. Evelyn moved to the woodpile, forcing her hands to work despite the sting. With each log she lifted, her eyes kept flicking toward the barn. A constant pulse of curiosity and dread twisted inside her. A quiet chant. What's in there? Why the noise? Why the light? By midday, the sun scorched her shoulders and neck. Her breaths came shallow, her mouth dry as chalk. She paused to wipe her forehead, the sweat burning into the cuts on her palms. That was when she heard it. A muffled cry, soft but sharp enough to cut through the drone of cicadas and the heat haze. Evelyn froze, her fingers still gripping a log. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto the barn doors. Another sound followed, a dragging noise, something heavy moving across a wooden floor. Her throat tightened, her ears ringing with the sudden rush of blood. She dropped the log and stepped forward before she could stop herself. Step by step she neared the barn, her breath catching on every exhale. At the doors she hesitated. A thin line of shadow marked the gap between them. She pressed her eye to it, squinting into the darkness. For a heartbeat, she saw nothing, only shapes and shifting gray. Then her vision adjusted. She saw a length of rope hanging from a ceiling beam. Beneath it, a large dark stain marred the wooden floor like a wound that refused to close. In the corner, a pile of cloth. Or was it a person? She couldn't tell. Her chest tightened so violently she thought she might faint. A sudden hand clamped on her shoulder. Evelyn screamed, stumbling back into the sunlight. Mr. Holt towered over her, his face carved in cold fury. "What did I tell you?" he hissed. His fingers dug into her shoulder, sending bolts of pain down her arm. She stammered, her lips moving without sound. He dragged her away from the barn, his grip iron strong. At the porch, he shoved her forward so hard she fell to her knees, her palms scraping the wood, reopening the cuts. "You do not look," he growled, leaning down so close she smelled the sourness of his breath. "You do not question." Evelyn pressed her forehead to the boards, her body shaking with silent sobs. He stood above her for a moment longer, his shadow stretching across her like a shroud. Then he turned and walked into the house, the door slamming behind him. She stayed on her knees, her fingers curling around the rough wood, her tears dripping into the dust below. And in that moment, through the roar of pain and fear, a single thought flared sharp and bright. I have to get out, even if it kills me. Evelyn remained on her knees long after Mr. Holt disappeared inside. The sun clawed at her back, pulling sweat through her dress until it clung to her spine. Every breath tasted of dust and blood, her shoulders burning from his grip. She pressed her forehead harder into the porch boards, willing her body to go still. But inside, her mind churned like a trapped animal. Every heartbeat thudding with the same word: escape. Finally, she forced herself to move. She rose unsteadily, wiping her face with the edge of her skirt. Her palms stung where the old cuts had torn open again, the skin raw and red. She turned to glance at the yard. The barn stood silent now, its doors closed and heavy as tombstones. Beyond it, the wide open land shimmered under the afternoon sun, so close, yet impossibly far. She looked toward the porch. The doorway yawned dark and empty. The older woman must still be inside. The limping ranch hand was nowhere to be seen. Evelyn stepped down from the porch, each footfall a silent promise to herself. She moved toward the side of the house, where a small path curved behind a row of brittle, half-dead bushes. She reached the edge of the yard, heart hammering against her ribs. A narrow trail led to the front gate, the same gate she had seen when she arrived, the same one she had watched disappear behind the wagon. Her eyes scanned the path, desperate for a break in the fence or an unlocked post. She took a cautious step forward, her breath shallow. Then she saw it. A heavy chain coiled around the gate's bars, a rusted lock gleaming dully in the sun. A wave of nausea washed over her. She rushed forward, her hands flying to the lock. She tugged, twisted, pulled until her fingers cramped, but it wouldn't budge. The iron felt alive under her skin, mocking her. Behind her, a floorboard creaked inside the house. Evelyn froze, her hands still gripping the chain. A low, measured voice rolled across the yard. "Where do you think you're going?" She turned slowly. Mr. Holt stood on the porch, his arms at his sides, one hand curled loosely, as if already imagining grabbing her again. His hat shaded most of his face, but she saw the thin line of his mouth, curved in something like amusement. Or hunger. "Answer me," he said, stepping down from the porch. Her throat closed. She tried to back away, but the chain behind her dug into her spine. He kept moving forward, each step slow and deliberate, his boots stirring tiny clouds of dust. "You think there's something out there for you?" he asked, his voice soft now, almost kind. "You think you can just walk away?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly. "There's nothing beyond this gate, nothing but emptiness and vultures." She pressed her back against the iron bars, her fingers gripping them as if they might turn to wings and carry her off. In a sudden movement, he lunged forward and grabbed her arm. She cried out, struggling, but his grip only tightened, turning her skin white beneath his fingers. He yanked her forward, dragging her across the yard. Her feet skidded over the dust, kicking up shallow trenches. At the porch, he threw her down. She hit the steps hard, her breath exploding from her lungs. He leaned over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You belong here," he growled. "You're mine now." She turned her head, coughing, her vision sparking at the edges. The barn loomed behind him, a dark, waiting maw. He straightened abruptly, glaring down at her one last time before disappearing inside the house. Evelyn lay there, her cheek pressed against the hot wood, her body shaking. Her chest burned with each breath, but through the pain one thought forced its way through like a blade. The lock can be opened. Chains can break. There has to be a way. She closed her eyes, tasting blood and dust, and felt something small and fierce take root deep inside her ribs. It felt like the beginning of a scream she had never dared let out, a spark that refused to die. When night finally draped itself across the ranch, the house seemed to breathe in the dark, each groan of its old boards echoing like a quiet threat. Evelyn lay curled on her cot, her body sore and her mind thrumming with restless energy. Every bruise ached with each shallow breath, but her thoughts stayed sharp, slicing through the pain. She replayed the chain at the gate in her mind, the way it clanged when she pulled it, the cold bite of the iron. "There has to be a key," she told herself over and over, the words turning into a desperate rhythm beneath her ribs. From the hallway she heard the soft shuffle of feet. She sat up, straining her ears. The door creaked open slightly, a thin sliver of lamplight spilling into her room. The old woman from the kitchen stood there, her face pale and hollow in the dim glow. For the first time, Evelyn saw her eyes clearly, gray, sunken, and flickering with something beyond fear. The woman stepped inside without a word, closing the door behind her. Evelyn's breath hitched. She pressed her back against the wall, unsure whether to flee or beg. The woman raised a trembling finger to her lips. Quiet. Slowly she moved closer and knelt beside Evelyn's cot. From within her apron pocket she drew out a small, heavy object wrapped in a scrap of cloth. With shaking hands she unwrapped it. A key. Old, worn, smooth at the edges, but unmistakably a gate key. Evelyn's eyes widened. Her hands flew to her mouth to stop the gasp from escaping. The woman's voice came out in a harsh whisper, as if each word tore at her throat. "Tonight, after the moon rises high, the orchard path, past the barn. Don't stop. Don't look back." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, hot and blinding. She reached out, her fingers closing around the key as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. The woman's lips trembled. She raised one shaking hand, brushing a stray lock of hair from Evelyn's forehead. A mother's touch, so soft it made Evelyn's entire chest clench. Then, as if the moment had never happened, the woman drew back sharply, her face flattening again into that hollow mask. She stood, turned, and slipped out of the room without another sound. Evelyn sat frozen, her fist closed so tight around the key that it bit into her skin. Her mind churned. The orchard path, the moon. Don't stop. She moved to the window, pulling the thin curtain aside. Outside, the moon hovered low, still climbing its slow arc toward the center of the sky. She counted each shaky breath, her eyes locked on the pale glow crawling across the yard. Her heart galloped inside her chest, each beat echoing in her ears like a drum of warning and promise. Tonight she would run, no matter the pain, no matter the darkness waiting beyond the gate. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass and closed her eyes, the key held tight against her heart. For the first time since stepping off that wagon, she felt a pulse of something real, fragile but alive, hope. The moon climbed higher, painting the ranch yard in long, pale streaks. Each blade of dry grass shimmered like silver needles, the ground a quilt of shifting shadows. Evelyn crouched near the window, her breath shallow, her fingers locked tight around the key. Her heart drummed so loudly she thought it might wake the entire house. She listened for any sound, the groan of a floorboard, the scrape of a boot. But the house remained still, heavy with its usual night silence. Slowly she rose. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to buckle. She pressed a hand to the wall to steady herself, the key cold and sharp against her palm. She crept to the door, easing it open an inch at a time. The hallway beyond was dark except for a thin glow leaking from under Mr. Holt's door at the far end. She held her breath, her ears straining for any movement. Nothing. She slipped into the hallway, her bare feet whispering against the warped boards. Her body felt too big for the narrow space, her breaths too loud. At the end of the hallway, she turned toward the back door. Each step felt endless, her body swaying with dizziness and fear. She imagined Holt's hand clamping around her shoulder again, dragging her backward into the dark. She reached the door and pushed it open slowly. The hinges let out a faint squeal. She froze, her spine rigid, waiting for a shout. But none came. Outside, the cold air slammed into her face, making her gasp. She stepped into the yard, closing the door behind her without a sound. The orchard path glimmered faintly in the moonlight, a narrow trail lined with stunted trees. She started toward it, her feet sinking into the soft dust. The barn loomed beside her, a hulking black shape. As she passed, a sudden thump echoed inside, a dull, heavy sound followed by something like a muffled cry. Evelyn's entire body went rigid. Her eyes snapped to the barn doors. The memory of the rope and dark stains clawed at her mind. A shudder ran through her, but the old woman's voice echoed inside her head. "Don't stop. Don't look back." She forced her feet to move, inch by inch past the barn, her breaths broken and ragged. At the edge of the orchard she paused, turning the key over in her palm. It felt impossibly small for what it promised. She squeezed it so hard her knuckles whitened. Beyond the orchard the trail curved toward the gate. She could see the faint line of the fence, the outline of the chain, and beyond that, open land. She stumbled forward, branches catching on her dress, snagging her hair. She pulled free, her lungs burning, her vision streaked with tears and moonlight. Halfway through the orchard she heard it, a door crashing open behind her. "Evelyn!" His voice cracked across the yard, sharp as a rifle shot. She gasped and ran, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Branches clawed at her arms and face. She pushed through, ignoring the pain, ignoring the blood. She heard him crashing through the orchard behind her, the ground trembling under each furious step. At the gate her hands fumbled with the lock. The key slipped once, then again, slick with sweat. "Evelyn!" She shoved the key into the lock and twisted. A loud, echoing click. She tore the chain free and flung the gate open, the hinges screaming in protest. Without looking back, she threw herself forward, past the fence line, into the dry, wild, open night. The cold air tore at her face as she ran, each breath a jagged knife in her chest. But even as her muscles screamed and her mind splintered with terror, a single word beat inside her like a war drum. "Go!" Evelyn ran until her lungs felt scorched, each breath scraping her throat like shards of glass. Her legs buckled under her more than once, but she pushed back to her feet, her hands clawing at the dirt and dry brush. Behind her, Holt's shouts rose and fell, echoing across the empty fields. Each yell cracked the night open, filling the darkness with the shape of his rage. She scrambled up a small ridge, the loose earth sliding under her palms. When she reached the top, she dared a glance back. The orchard lay behind her in a churning mass of shadows and silver light. She saw the dark shape of Holt thrashing through the trees, lantern light swinging wildly in his hand. His voice ripped through the air, raw and frantic. "Evelyn, stop! You can't outrun me!" She turned away, heart pounding so loudly she could feel it in her teeth. Her vision blurred, the stars overhead smearing into long streaks as tears filled her eyes. At the bottom of the ridge, she stumbled into a narrow wash, a dry gully lined with brittle weeds and sharp stones. She fell hard, her knee striking a buried rock. Pain shot up her thigh, and for a moment she lay still, choking on her sobs. Above her, the moon lit the path ahead, a faint, pale trail winding deeper into the open land. Evelyn forced herself up, her whole body trembling. She limped forward, her breath ragged, every inch of her skin screaming with scrapes and cuts. Her fingers brushed the key still tied in her skirt pocket, a small, heavy presence, reminding her she had broken the first chain. Behind her, the orchard had grown silent. No more shouts, no crashing branches, only the thin night wind whistling through the grass. She knew he wouldn't give up. He would come. He would follow. But each step she took now pushed her farther into a world he couldn't control. She paused, listening. In the distance, a faint muffled sound, a dog barking maybe, or a far-off farm. The possibility of other lives flickered in her mind like a candle in a storm. She pressed her palm to her knee, wincing, and kept moving. At the edge of the wash, she found a patch of low brush and dropped to her knees beneath it, curling herself as small as she could. Her heart thundered against the dry earth, each beat a fierce, defiant echo. She listened to the land breathing around her, insects buzzing, the far-off cry of an owl, the shifting of grasses in the night wind. She closed her eyes, tears leaking down her temples, mixing with the dust and blood on her cheeks. Tonight she was not safe. She was not free. But she was beyond his walls, past the gate, past the porch steps where he had forced her to kneel. For the first time since stepping off that wagon, she felt her soul stretch, raw and trembling, towards something she hadn't dared imagine in days. The taste of open air, the first tiny seed of freedom. She tightened her fist around the fabric of her skirt and whispered to herself, so softly the wind nearly swallowed it, "Keep going." The night deepened around Evelyn like a heavy blanket, thick with the scent of dry grass and dust. She stayed crouched beneath the low brush, her body curled tight, listening to every sound. Her knee throbbed with each heartbeat, sharp pain flickering up her thigh. She pressed her palm against it, trying to quiet the trembling that shivered through her bones. Far off, a lantern bobbed through the orchard, a pale, swinging light that carved the night into uneven shards. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Even at this distance, she knew it was him. She ducked lower, pressing her face into the cold dirt. The lantern swung left, then right, weaving slowly as if sniffing for her scent. A low, hoarse shout rose into the air. "Evelyn!" She flinched, her fingers clawing at the dry earth. The voice crawled over her skin like hot wire. The lantern paused at the edge of the orchard, its glow flickering. Then it moved again, down the path toward the gate she had broken open. She waited, counting each breath, her heart rattling like a tin can in her chest. The night around her seemed to hold its breath too. Minutes crawled by. Slowly the light faded, swallowed by the folds of the field beyond the orchard. His footsteps vanished into the dark, but she knew better than to believe he was gone. She uncurled slowly, her muscles screaming in protest. She peered over the brush. The world looked washed out in moonlight, soft, unreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. Evelyn shifted, pulling her legs beneath her. She tested her weight on her injured knee, wincing but refusing to collapse. She scanned the horizon. Far off she saw a thin line of trees, darker than the fields, and beyond them a faint suggestion of rooftops, perhaps a farmhouse, maybe a shed. It might be help, or just another trap. She turned her face toward the wind, feeling it slide across her bruises, cooling her fevered skin. She imagined her father's voice, not as it had been in the nightmare, but as it had sounded in better years, low and warm, humming in the evenings. "Keep moving, Evie," she heard him say in her mind. She pushed herself forward, crawling out from the brush. Each step felt like knives against her knee, but she forced her legs to obey. The world beyond the fence shimmered before her, vast and silent. She limped across the open field, weaving between tufts of wild grass and rocks. Every few steps she glanced back, expecting to see his dark shape rising behind her. But the orchard stayed still, the broken gate standing open like a wound. She kept her eyes on the distant trees, repeating the words like a prayer with each ragged breath. "Keep moving, keep moving." At one point she stumbled and fell to her hands. She stayed there, shaking, the cold night seeping into her skin. Then she crawled forward on all fours until she found enough strength to stand again. Finally, when the horizon began to pale, a thin blue bruising the edge of the sky, she reached the first line of trees. She slipped between them, finding a small hollow beneath their tangled roots. She collapsed there, her body folding in on itself. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion and terror. Above her the sky shifted slowly, the first stars blinking out as the world turned toward dawn. In the hollow, Evelyn curled tighter, clutching the key against her chest like a talisman. She didn't know if she would live to see another night. But in that final moment before sleep claimed her, she held one truth like a burning coal in her palms. She was no longer his. Whatever happened next, she had crossed the boundary, torn the chain, and stepped into the unknown on her own feet. And for the first time, even as darkness threatened to drag her under, she felt a thin, trembling thread of something almost forgotten. Possibility. Evelyn woke to a dull, gray dawn. The sky above the trees looked heavy, as if it might collapse under its own weight. Her body felt like a single bruise, her limbs stiff and uncooperative. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the crust of dried tears and dirt. The hollow beneath the roots smelled of cold earth and old leaves, and for a moment she didn't remember where she was. Only the deep, echoing ache in her bones. Then it all flooded back. The orchard, the key, the gate swinging open, Holt's voice slicing through the night. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling for the key. It was still there, wrapped in a knot of her skirt, its weight grounding her in the haze. Evelyn dragged herself upright, her knee throbbing like a warning bell. She peered through the thin screen of branches. Beyond them, the open field spread wide and pale, a quilt of dry grass trembling in the morning breeze. No sign of Holt, no swinging lantern, no boots crushing the weeds. She crawled out from her hiding place, each movement tearing small, pained gasps from her throat. Standing took every shred of will left in her. She leaned against a tree trunk, her forehead pressed to its rough bark, waiting for the dizziness to pass. In the distance, she saw it again, the suggestion of buildings beyond the next field, maybe barns, maybe a small house. Smoke curled faintly from what looked like a chimney. She swallowed hard. Help or danger? She would have to find out. Evelyn limped forward, her good leg dragging the bad one through the brittle grass. Each step felt as though she was walking on shards of glass. She clutched her skirt in one hand, her other arm hugging her ribs where the bruises burned. She moved slowly, scanning the horizon every few minutes. The wind rose and fell, carrying the scent of wood smoke and far-off cattle. Each sound, a bird's call, the rustle of a bush, made her flinch and twist, expecting Holt's voice to crash through the stillness. When she reached the far edge of the field, she crouched low behind a patch of tall weeds. Her heart pounded against her ribs, so loud it felt like it might betray her. Closer now, she saw a weather-beaten fence, half collapsed in places. Beyond it, a small farmyard spread out, an old house, a leaning barn, a chicken coop. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney, and she thought she heard the faint clink of a pail. A person? She pressed her forehead into the weeds, her breath hitching in painful, broken sobs. It could be salvation. It could be another trap. But standing still meant certain death. She gathered what little strength she had left and pushed forward. At the fence, she found a gap wide enough to slip through. The wood scraped her shoulders, but she hardly felt it. She stumbled across the yard, nearly collapsing when her bad knee gave out again. As she crawled toward the house, she saw movement at the doorway. A woman, older, hair tied back in a rag, an apron wrapped around her waist. The woman's eyes widened. She stepped forward, her hands hovering in the air, as if afraid to touch Evelyn. "Child?" the woman whispered. Evelyn opened her mouth, but no words came. Only a raw, rattling sound escaped. The woman rushed forward, catching Evelyn just as she began to fall. Strong, warm arms wrapped around her, guiding her weight gently to the ground. "It's all right now," the woman said, her voice soft but firm, trembling at the edges. "You're safe. You're safe here." Evelyn clung to the woman's apron, her fingers knotting into the fabric. Tears poured down her cheeks, washing thin rivers into the dirt on her skin. The woman stroked her hair, murmuring something low and steady. The farmyard around them seemed to hush, as if the world itself paused to listen. And in that tight, trembling grip, for the first time since the wagon ride, Evelyn felt something inside her crack open. Not just fear or pain, but a glimmer of relief so sharp it almost hurt. She pressed her face into the woman's side, the last echoes of Holt's voice fading somewhere far behind her. She was no longer a shadow in his house, no longer a ghost on his porch. Here she might begin again, or at least learn what it meant to try. Evelyn didn't remember being carried inside. One moment she clung to the woman's apron, and the next she lay on a narrow bed, her head sinking into a pillow that smelled faintly of soap and dried herbs. The room around her felt small and warm, the walls lined with patched quilts and shelves stacked with chipped mugs and jars of dried flowers. A thin, pale curtain fluttered in the open window, letting in a soft breeze that cooled her fevered skin. The woman moved quietly, a shape of gentle urgency. She dipped a cloth into a basin and pressed it to Evelyn's forehead. Evelyn winced at the first touch, but didn't pull away. "You're safe here," the woman murmured, her voice as soft as worn linen. "Rest. You need rest." Evelyn tried to speak. Her lips parted, but her throat locked around the words. Only a broken whisper escaped, a noise more like an echo than a voice. "Shh," the woman said again, smoothing Evelyn's hair back from her face. Her hands smelled faintly of wood smoke and rosemary. The woman examined her knee, clucking her tongue at the angry swelling. She wrapped it carefully with strips of cloth, each movement precise and tender. Evelyn bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, fighting the urge to scream. After binding the wound, the woman sat back, studying her. "My name is May," she finally said. "You don't have to tell me yours yet. When you're ready." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She swallowed hard and nodded, her fingers curling into the quilt beneath her. May stood and crossed to the corner, stirring something in a small pot over a stove. The smell of broth drifted through the room, warm and salty, stirring a sharp, almost painful hunger in Evelyn's belly. When May returned, she carried a cup of broth and a chipped spoon. She helped Evelyn sit up, bracing her shoulders with surprising strength. "Slowly now," May urged, raising the spoon to Evelyn's lips. The first sip burned her cracked mouth, but filled her chest with warmth that felt almost human again. She took another, then another, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't hold the cup on her own. When the cup was empty, May lowered her back onto the pillow, wiping the edges of her mouth. "You've been running a long way, haven't you?" May asked softly, her eyes searching Evelyn's face. Evelyn hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Her fingers drifted to the key still tied in her skirt pocket, hidden beneath the quilt. May saw the movement. She looked down but didn't ask, only set a hand lightly over Evelyn's wrist. "Whatever you had to do to get here," May said, her voice steady and low, "it's done now. You're out." Evelyn's chest heaved, a sob rising that she couldn't swallow down. It ripped out of her, raw and jagged, tearing at her ribs as if it had waited too long to be born. May bent forward, wrapping her arms around her shoulders. Evelyn buried her face against the woman's neck, her whole body shaking as the sobs came in waves. "You're safe," May whispered over and over, her hand stroking Evelyn's back. "You're safe." The room blurred and shimmered with each tear. Evelyn felt the cold, dead fingers of the ranch falling away piece by piece, each memory leaving a raw mark behind. By the time her sobs faded, she lay limp against May, her breath shallow but no longer panicked. May pressed a gentle kiss to her hair and eased her back onto the pillow. "Rest," she murmured. "We'll talk later. For now, just rest." Evelyn's eyes fluttered closed, her fingers still curled protectively around the hidden key. As she slipped into sleep, the last thing she felt was the warmth of May's hand on her forehead and the thin, fragile thread of safety weaving itself through her bones. Evelyn woke to the scent of broth and the gentle clink of a spoon against a pot. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The soft quilt, the warm air, the steady rhythm of another person moving nearby felt so impossibly distant from the dust and silence of the ranch. Then she remembered. The orchard, the gate, the chase. May's arms pulling her inside. She opened her eyes slowly. Light filtered through the thin curtain, casting pale shapes across the quilt. Her body ached deeply, but the pain felt real now, something she could touch instead of an endless, shapeless terror. May sat at a small wooden table in the corner, peeling carrots into a chipped bowl. When she heard Evelyn stir, she looked up, her lined face softening. "Good morning," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Or nearly afternoon, I suppose." Evelyn tried to push herself up. Her arms shook, and May rushed over, steadying her with a gentle but firm grip. "Slowly," May urged, sliding a pillow behind her back. "No need to rush." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. She looked around the room again, the herbs drying above the stove, the small shelf lined with mismatched cups, the cracked window with a view of the pale sky. "It's safe here," May said, as if reading her thoughts. "He won't come this far. People around here, they look out for each other. And I've got a good old rifle if he tries." Evelyn's lips parted, a broken sound rising, but no words followed. She glanced down at her skirt, her fingers drifting to the knot where the key was still hidden. May followed her gaze and reached out, laying her hand gently over Evelyn's. "You don't have to show me. Not yet," she said softly. "Whatever you brought with you, it's yours. You decide when to share." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. She squeezed her fingers around the key, feeling its cool metal press into her skin like an anchor. May gave her hand a light squeeze before moving back to the table. She ladled broth into a small bowl and returned, holding it out carefully. "Eat," she urged. "Strength first. Talking can wait." Evelyn took the bowl, her hands trembling. The broth smelled rich and earthy, and the first sip slid down her throat like a soft promise. She swallowed slowly, her breath catching between each spoonful. Between sips, her gaze drifted to the window. Beyond it, the fields stretched wide and open, a patchwork of pale grasses and distant tree lines. A small blackbird landed on the fence, hopping along the rail before taking off again into the pale sky. With every sip, her mind tried to reach backward, to the dark hallway, to the barn door, to Holt's voice slicing the night. But each time, May's presence pulled her gently back, as if holding her tethered to this small, warm room. When the bowl was empty, May took it from her hands and set it aside. She studied Evelyn's face for a long moment. "You're strong," she said finally. "Stronger than you think. You crossed that fence, child. You did what many before you couldn't." A sob rose in Evelyn's chest, but she swallowed it, her throat moving in a tight, painful shudder. May leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently to Evelyn's. "Rest again," she whispered. "Your body needs it, your spirit too." Evelyn closed her eyes. The quilt felt heavier now, not like a weight pressing her down, but like arms holding her close. She let her fingers fall away from the key, her hand sliding to her side. As sleep pulled her under, she heard May move about the room, the soft clink of the bowl, the quiet rustle of peeling carrots. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds. And in that drifting space between waking and sleep, for the first time since the wagon ride, Evelyn felt a small, trembling certainty flicker in her chest. She had truly stepped into another life, one she might somehow learn to belong to. Evelyn woke in the late afternoon to the golden hush of sunlight slanting through the small window. The house felt quiet, but not empty. She could hear May's soft humming from somewhere beyond the room, a tune so gentle it felt like a blanket laid over her bruised spirit. She shifted beneath the quilt, her fingers brushing the knot where the key was hidden in her skirt. The metal felt less like a weapon now, more like a reminder, proof that she had chosen, that she had acted, that she had survived. Her body still ached, her knee pulsing in slow waves, but she felt stronger somehow, like the pain was no longer just punishment, but a mark of having crossed a line no one could force her behind again. After a while, May appeared at the doorway, a fresh bandage in one hand and a steaming mug in the other. "Good," May said, her eyes crinkling. "You're awake. I've got something for that leg." She set the mug on the table and knelt beside the bed, unwrapping the old bandage with steady fingers. Evelyn winced, but didn't pull away. May glanced up once, her gaze calm and warm, silently asking permission to continue. Evelyn nodded. "Brave girl," May murmured as she worked. "I've seen many run through these fields. Not many make it past the fence, you know. But you've got something different in you." Evelyn's throat tightened. She opened her mouth, but her voice cracked into a broken whisper. I didn't want to die there," she managed. Her words felt rusty, as though they'd been buried under dust for years. May's hands paused for a moment, her eyes rising to meet Evelyn's. Then she nodded slowly, her face both proud and mournful. "No one should have to make that choice," she said softly. "But you did, and you lived." She finished wrapping the fresh bandage, patting it lightly before standing. "Drink," she said, nodding toward the mug. Evelyn reached for it, wrapping her hands around the warmth. The smell of mint and honey rose up, soothing and sharp all at once. She took a careful sip, the liquid sliding down her throat, easing the rawness inside. For a long moment they sat in silence. Outside, the wind rustled the thin trees near the house, and the creak of a distant weather vane drifted through the open window. May finally broke the quiet. "You have plans?" she asked. "Where you'll go next?" Evelyn lowered the mug, her eyes tracing the quilt's faded pattern. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just wanted to be away. I didn't think past the gate." May gave a small, understanding nod. "That's enough for now," she said. "The world beyond the gate can be decided tomorrow, or the day after. For today, you're safe. You're here." Evelyn felt a single tear slip down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, embarrassed by its suddenness. May leaned forward, her hand resting lightly on Evelyn's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "Not if you don't want to be." Evelyn pressed her lips together, fighting another wave of tears. May stood, smoothing her apron. "Rest again," she urged. "I'll make supper soon. After that, if you're ready, we can talk more." Evelyn nodded, clutching the mug to her chest like a shield. As May left the room, her humming returned, floating gently through the doorway. Evelyn sank deeper into the pillow, her eyes closing despite the soft glow of daylight. She heard the words in her mind, over and over, until they became a warm, steady heartbeat inside her. "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time since the wagon rattled up to that porch, Evelyn believed it might be true. That evening, as the sun melted into a deep orange haze beyond the fields, Evelyn sat at May's small wooden table. The window stood open, letting in the scent of cool dust and the distant sweetness of wildflowers. May moved about the kitchen, her motions smooth and unhurried. A small pot simmered on the stove, filling the room with the rich smell of stewed vegetables and herbs. Every so often, May glanced over her shoulder at Evelyn, as if to reassure her without saying a word. Evelyn sat with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. The key lay hidden beneath her skirt still, but tonight she touched it less out of fear and more out of memory, a reminder of where she had come from and how far she had already traveled. When May finally sat down across from her, she offered a gentle, expectant look. "You feel ready to talk?" she asked softly. Evelyn lowered her gaze to her tea, her fingers trembling around the rim. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she drew in a shaking breath. "I don't know how to start," she whispered. "Start anywhere," May said. "You don't have to tell it all at once." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. Slowly she began. She spoke of the wagon ride, the dry wind clawing at her skin. She spoke of Holt's cold voice, the heavy silence of the hallway, the barn doors that hid more than she could name. When she spoke of the rope, her voice faltered. Her lips parted, but no sound came. May reached across the table, covering Evelyn's hand with her own. Evelyn squeezed it tightly, grounding herself in the warmth of another human touch. She spoke of the gate, of the key, of running until her legs collapsed beneath her. Each word dragged out of her like a thorn, leaving her raw and trembling. When she finally stopped, the room felt thick with her story, the walls heavy with the echoes of what she had carried alone for too long. May's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She simply held Evelyn's hand, nodding slowly, her breath deep and steady. "You are free of that place now," May said. "Your life isn't his to hold any more. You took it back." Evelyn pressed her forehead to their joined hands, her shoulders shaking. "I don't know where to go," she admitted in a small voice. "I don't know who I am without him, without the fear." May squeezed her hand, firm and certain. "You start small," she said. "You learn to wake up without listening for boots on the floor. You learn the smell of real bread, the feel of clean water, the warmth of a sunrise that isn't a threat." Evelyn's tears slid down her cheeks, soaking into May's hand. "You choose each next step," May continued, leaning closer, "and when you're ready you can go wherever you want. Or stay. There's room here if you wish." Evelyn looked up, her breath catching on a soft, broken laugh. The idea of choosing anything felt like a foreign language, terrifying and bright. But as she held May's gaze, something deep inside her shifted. The girl who had clutched a rope and a key in the moonlight began to fade, leaving behind a new outline of someone she did not yet know, but might, one day, come to love. Outside, a breeze stirred, rustling the fields beyond the fence line she had once thought unbreakable. The wind smelled of dust and wild sage, and for the first time Evelyn leaned into it, letting it wash over her. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and drew in a deep, steady breath. "I want to try," she whispered. May smiled, her eyes warm and shining. "That's enough," she said. "That's everything." And in that small kitchen, beneath the quiet hum of the evening and the soft, forgiving sky, Evelyn felt the first fragile shape of her future settle into her bones, heavy with possibility, trembling with the promise of a life she could finally call her own.